I know Michael Steele. We met in Hollandsley Bay Prison. Yes, I know Jack Wilmes. I met him at Hollandsley Bay Prison as well. And yes, I know Patrick Tate. I met him too at Hollandsley Bay Prison. I was given my last prison sentence in November 1992. I met Mr. Steele about Christmas 92, Mr. Wilmes about January 1993. I met Mr. Tate about April 93, and I saw quite a lot of Mr. Steele, Mr. Wilmes and Mr. Tate while I was in Hollandsley Bay. My relationship with the three of them was quite good. I was released from that sentence on the 19th of May 1994. Mr. Steele had left when I left Hollandsley Bay Prison. Mr. Steele left the prison in 1993, about May or June time. He left because he was released. Mr. Wilmes had also been released when I left, approximately September, October 1993. Mr. Tate had left when I had left. He left because he'd been transferred. I saw Mr. Tate again when I'd left on the 19th of May 1994. About 6 months after I'd been released, I saw Mr. Tate at Basildon Hospital. I phoned him on his mobile phone before I went to see him at the hospital. I got his phone number from Mr. Steele. I don't think I'd spoken to him before this. After I'd visited him at hospital, I contacted Mr. Steele. I don't remember how the contact was made after the hospital visit. I can't remember if it was me who contacted Mr. Steele or he contacted me. I next met Mr. Steele at Patrick Tate's bungalow in Basildon. Just Mickey Steele was there at the bungalow. He was the only person I saw anyway. As far as I know at the time, I think Mr. Tate had been locked up again. We had arranged to see each other at Mr. Tate's bungalow. I think Mr. Steele had asked to see me. When I arrived, I do not know what generally he asked me. When I arrived, Mr. Steele was building a brick wall at the front of the bungalow. He told me why he wanted to see me. He wanted to show me some cannabis resin and asked me if I could sell it. Yes, I did see some cannabis resin when I went there. He wanted me to sell it if I could. A price was mentioned, about £600 a bar. I was given 1 or 2 bars of cannabis, I cannot remember. I told him I would try and sell it. Yes, I did sell it. With the money I got paid, I paid Mr. Steele. I made some money, not a lot out of it myself. I'm not sure if I'd been to Mr. Steele's house by then or not. I don't remember the first time I went to Mr. Steele's house. I went there the first time probably to give him the money for the drugs. Mr. Steele's house was just outside Great Bentley in Essex, Anglers Green. I think the name of the street was something like Stafford St Mary. I've been to his house lots of times. The other times I went there were for more drugs. Mr. Steele had, of course, as I'm aware, the house he lived in and his mum's house. Mr. Steele lived with his girlfriend, or common law wife. Her name is Jackie. Mr. Tate did have a girlfriend. Her name was Sarah. I did see Sarah once while Mr. Tate was in prison. That was in Mr. Steele's garden sunbathing. Mickey, Jackie and Sarah's little boy was also there. Jackie and Sarah were friends from what I could see. Mr. Steele did not talk about Sarah at that time. Mr. Steele talked about her at a later time. He said he felt very sorry for her and that Pat was a nasty person. He didn't say anything else. I went to Sarah's house when she left Pat to look at her fridge because it didn't work. Because she left Pat and was living somewhere else, Sarah didn't appear to have a job from what I could see. Her finances were mentioned by Mickey Steele. He said he was looking after Pat's money and he would give her some every month, week, I can't remember which. Yes, it did happen again. Mr. Steele did give me cannabis to sell. I did have a valid passport for 1 year. It was due to expire at approximately the beginning of December 1995. After Mickey Steele told me about the drugs, yes, I did go abroad. After I'd done wiring at Mick's mum's and another property, he asked me if I wanted to be involved in smuggling drugs. I asked him what my involvement was and said yes. I can remember the first time abroad. Mickey Steele, Peter Corey and myself went. I'm not certain if I was told what would happen, I can't recall, but I knew basically what was going to happen. All 3 of us travelled together. The first time we went in my Golf convertible and I drove. The first time we crossed over to Folkestone, I think. It was the ferry crossing quite late at night. We got there about 4 o'clock, I think, in the morning in Ostend. Mick paid for the ticket, but I purchased the ticket. It was a 5-day return, I think. I bought the car on the ferry. When we got to Ostend, we drove along the Ostend harbour. Mick showed me where they used to smuggle drugs, and then we drove off and I drove to Amsterdam. When we got to Amsterdam, we parked on the square and went to a bar called Stone's Calf. All 3 of us went. When we got there, we waited for John Stone to arrive and went upstairs to the flat above the calf and had a meeting. At the meeting with John Stone, myself, Peter Corey and Mick Steele, and I think there were some others floating in and out, I can't remember. I never met John Stone before this. At this meeting, we discussed the price and availability of drugs, and it was also to introduce myself to John Stone, as Mickey Steele would not be going abroad again. There were no drugs for sale at the moment, but because we brought money with us to buy drugs, and we couldn't say when there was going to be any drugs for sale, and Mickey didn't want to take the money back through customs to England, we left the money there with John Stone. The money was physically in a bag with us. The money would have been counted, but it would have been checked at a later date, after the meeting. There was about £80,000 in English currency, 5, 10, 20, 50. Drugs were going to be bought in on guilders. We had to work the exchange rate out on teletext. After the meeting, we came back again. We were going to go back to Ostend, but Mick decided we would go back through the tunnel, so we did. Mick paid for the tickets, but I bought them for the return journey. We arrived back at the Euro tunnel. I returned abroad again within 2 days from returning, the day after the day we got back. I knew to go back as John Stone had phoned Mick. Mickey Steele then phoned me. Peter Croy and myself went on the trip. We took a B registration Peugeot diesel car. The car was beige. I picked up Mr. Corey from outside a pub in Clacton. Mickey Steele was with me when I met Mr. Corey because I drove him to a cash point to get some money for the crossing. Peter Corey was given the money. Mickey Steele gave the money to him. We then drove to Kent again. I think we went to Folkestone, to Ostend again. The second time, I can't remember which port we went to. I brought the tickets with the money from Peter Corey. I bought a return ticket, as they tend to be cheaper than one way. We arrived in Ostend early in the morning again. When we got to Ostend, we went to Amsterdam in the Peugeot. We then parked in approximately the same place as last time. It was quite early before the bar opened, which was Stone's Caff, but they let us in anyway because there were people there. When we got to Stone's Caff, we saw John Stone when he arrived. We did get some drugs that time. We had to wait for the drugs. They agreed we could follow the man with the drugs out of town, pass the drugs over when we were out of Amsterdam. This is what happened. When we got the drugs, we intended to drive to Blankenberg. When we left Amsterdam, we stopped at a payphone and contacted Mickey Steele to say we'd got the drugs and everything was okay. We had a mobile telephone number of Mr. Steele. I can't remember what the number was. I think I spoke to Mr. Steele, as I have a good memory for numbers. I didn't have them written down. We did not agree a time we got to Blankenberg. It was all pre-arranged. When we got to Blankenberg, we parked in a car park in the marina, as we were quite early for the meeting, and walked round to the meeting point. Me and Mr. Corey knew where the meeting point was. The drugs we had were cannabis resin. They were packaged in black bags, sealed and in holders, like sports bags. After we checked it was okay, and had something to eat, we drove the car around there and carried the drugs to the beach. We were to make contact with Mickey Steele at the beach. Mickey Steele was getting there in his boat. It was a semi-ridged inflatable boat, I think a Humber Attack. I had seen the boat before at the factory unit in Blightonsea, where I'd done some electrics, and we put the boat together. We made contact with Mr. Steele with the walkie-talkie and a torch. At a certain time, we were to turn on the walkie-talkie and make contact with Mr. Steele. I can't recall if it was me or Mr. Corey who turned it on. After a while, we heard a voice of Mr. Steele from the walkie-talkie. After we heard his voice, we proceeded to the beach and flashed a torch so we could see where we were, and he brought the boat to us. When the boat came in, we waded out into the water and brought the drugs into the boat. Mr. Corey got into the boat with the drugs. This had been pre-arranged. After Mr. Corey got in, they sped off, and I was told to go and ring Jack Womes and say they were on their way. Mickey told me to contact him. I misheard him. I thought he said they would be there in the morning. I gave Jack Womes the wrong message. I had Mr. Womes' mobile telephone number. I then drove back to Ostend and couldn't get on the ferry. I can't remember if it was too late or fully booked, so I decided to get a crossing from Boulogne or Calais. I drove there. I bought a return ticket because it was cheaper than a one-way ticket. When I got back to England, I saw Mr. Steele the same day, or the next day I got back. When I saw him, I wanted to get paid for my part in it. I was supposed to get £2,000, but received drugs instead. I got 1 or 2 kilos of cannabis resin, but not all for the payment. I had £2,000 worth for payment, and the rest I owed. The drugs I was given I sold. I sold them for more than £2,000, that was my payment. With the extra, I paid Mr. Steele the money I owed him, and the remainder I kept. I went abroad again, about 1 month after the second trip. It came about the same time as the first and second trip. I collected the money from Mr. Steele. Me and Peter Corey went this time. I got there as a walk-on passenger from Harwich to the Hook of Holland, and then I got a train. I went to Harwich in my car, which I think was the Volkswagen Sirocco. The drugs were to be paid for in cash. We did have the cash in a holdall. We picked up the cash from Mickey Steele's house. When we went to his house, there was me, Mr. Steele, Mr. Corey, and Jack Worms. I helped count the money. There was approximately 125,000 in sterling. While I was at the house, there was discussion about whose money it was. Mickey Steele was talking about whose money it was. We were counting it to make sure the owners had given what they said. The owners were mentioned of Pat Tate, Gordon Stevens, Jack Worms, and Michael Steele. At this time, Mr. Tate was out of prison as far as I'm aware. Approximately £70,000 was said to be Patrick Tate's. Approximately £28,000 was Gordon Stevens. Approximately £14,000 was Mr. Worms, and about £14,000 was Mr. Steele's. The money was counted. Mr. Tate's was short by a few £100s. Mick said he would make a note of it and tell Pat he would have to give him the additional. The money was packed into bundles and elastic banded together and carried in a holdall. Preference of drugs was to be grass, if not cannabis resin. We'd been given some spending money by Mickey, and I had some money of my own. It was not my intention to take the Sirocco on the trip. We were going to rent a car at the other side. It was Mick's idea to rent a car because he thought it would be better to have a foreign car in a foreign country rather than an English one. When we got to Harwich, I bought the tickets in my name. I paid for them in cash. Stones Calf is about a 400 yards walk up the Damrack, and it's on the left about one street down the main road. It takes no more than 5 or 10 minutes at the most. We walked to the calf when we got there. We saw John Stone when we got to the calf. We asked for grass if there was any, or cannabis. We were told there was no grass available, cannabis only. Mick agreed the price for the drugs. I checked the exchange rate to make sure they're not having them over. I work it out on a calculator, and we agree. I was not given the drugs immediately. I had to hire a hire car from Eurocar at Underton, which is the name of a road. I intended to pay with cash for the hire of the car. When we got to the car, they wouldn't accept cash, and I didn't have a big enough limit on my credit card to pay for it. I had changed my cash into guilders. I phoned TSB Bank in Braintree and told them I was stuck in Amsterdam. And they said if my wife would go in and deposit some cash, they would authorise the transaction. So I phoned my wife and asked her to borrow some money and pay it into the bank for me. I told my wife to pay in about £250. While I was waiting for this to happen, I panicked somewhere else back in Amsterdam Central in the middle of town. After the bank said they would clear the transaction, they gave me a code number to give to Eurocar. Me and Peter Corey and John Stone went back to Eurocar. I don't know where the drugs were at the time. We hadn't got any. Eventually we hired a car. It took about an hour. We were given a red Seat. After we got the car, John Stone and Mr. Corey got in the car and directed us to a back street in Amsterdam. When we got to the back street, John Stone went away and returned with a few other people, and I opened the boot of the car. They were all carrying boxes and put them in the boot of the car. We then went to Blankenberg. After we got the drugs, as before, we phoned Mr. Steele. On that occasion, I couldn't get through to him as it was so late, so I phoned Mr. Worms on his mobile phone. I told him we were now in possession and we should make it on time, and he said fine. We drove straight to Blankenberg. The drugs were transferred to bags. We had to buy a bag as they were not been supplied in them as they usually did. I bought a multicoloured sports bag. I put my clothes in the multicoloured bag and put the drugs in my sports bag as it was better. There were 3 bags altogether, and we still had to leave some in the box, I think. We carried the drugs the same in the bag to the meeting point on the beach. We had to wait quite a while, about half an hour. A marine band, walkie-talkie and a torch were used again. I turned the walkie-talkie on and eventually spoke to Mickey Steele. After I spoke to Mickey Steele, I carried the drugs down to the beach and didn't make any contact with him because we were in the wrong place. I knew we were in the wrong place, but Peter Corey wouldn't have it. Mickey Steele had told me that Peter Corey was always right out of the two of us, so I believed him and stood there. After we got no response, I turned the radio on and spoke to Mick again. He said we're in the wrong place and what were we doing there. He came towards us and we headed towards the place where we should have been. We met at the boat, put the drugs in. Peter Corey got in. One of the bags I was carrying broke and fell into the sea. I had to cuddle it. It was heavy. I was carrying a bag strapped to my back. Peter Corey was carrying the box. I was wearing waders which came up to my chest so we could go further into the water. As Mick complained, he was beaching his boat. After Mr. Corey got into the boat, went back to my car, phoned Jack Womes and told him they had left, and then I drove back to Amsterdam. When I got back to Amsterdam, I couldn't find the car hire place, so I went to Amsterdam Central and paid a cab driver to follow him there. He then gave me a lift to the hotel. The hotel was on the Damrak, called the Delta Hotel. When I got there, I got changed and went out for a drink. I stayed the night there. The next morning I got back on the train that goes to the boat, got on the boat and back to England, the same route as I came over, back to Harwich. I left the Scirocco at Harwich. I then drove home.